guys, today what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to explain to you how oxygen knows to bind to the iron on hemoglobin when it's in the lungs, and then when that oxygen gets down to the cells, how does it know to let go? So, a couple of things you got to know. Number one, there's a big protein inside inside a red blood cell called hemoglobin. That says hemoglobin. And it's a big molecule. As a matter of fact, each red blood cell has, on average, about 250 million molecules of hemoglobin. So there's so much hemoglobin inside a red blood cell, there's no room for mitochondria. So glucose is the only fuel a red blood cell can use. The other thing that's important to remember is that iron is actually embedded in the hemoglobin. And that iron is what the oxygen binds to. And remember, in the body, things always go from high to low. So let's take a look at this for a minute. And again, most of this stuff is a review and that you know. It's just kind of building on what we've already learned. So if you recall, you have the right side of the heart. And the right side of the heart, it collects all the venous blood from the body. Right? And that venous blood, because it came from the cells, is high in carbon dioxide, which is a waste product of metabolism, and low in oxygen, because you got to get that oxygen up to the cells. Excuse me. For aerobic metabolism. So that blood, that venous blood, is now going to get pumped by the right ventricle to the lungs. So if you look at a kind of blown up version of the pulmonary capillaries and the alveoli, this is how it looks. So again, you got the right ventricle pumping that venous blood, that blood that's high in CO2 and low in oxygen, through the pulmonary arteries, arterioles, and then it's going to get to the pulmonary capillaries. We talked about the fact that every pulmonary capillary is associated with the one cell thick membrane called an alveoli. And the air that we breathe is high in oxygen, right, and low in CO2. And where do things always go, right? They always go from high to low. So the CO2 that was formed by the cells is going to leave the blood and go into the alveoli. And the oxygen that you breathe is going to come into the blood. And the vast majority of that oxygen is going to bind to the iron on hemoglobin. So as oxygen comes into the blood, it's going to see this iron, and there's a natural attraction between the oxygen and the iron in the hemoglobin in a red blood cell. So this is what's referred to when oxygen binds to the iron on hemoglobin as oxygen saturation. Now, if you work as an aide or work in a doctor's office, they will do what's called a pulse ox. Right? They put the little papy, or the little clothespin-y type looking thing on the finger, and that uses ultraviolet light, and it looks, not ultraviolet light, it looks at, I don't know what kind of light it uses. I forget. Anywho, that pulse ox, what it's actually measuring is the amount of oxygen bound to the iron on hemoglobin. And when that venous blood gets pumped by the right side of the heart and goes through the lungs, in a normal person, 96 to 98% of all of the iron in all of the hemoglobin is going to have oxygen bound to it when it comes back to the left side of the heart. So that's what's referred to as oxygen saturation. And it's measured by the little pulse ox. Now, let's look very quickly. Remember, you got venous blood coming back from the cells of the body being dumped into the right side of the heart. The right side of the heart then sends that blood to the lungs to get oxygenated and remove the carbon dioxide. Then that newly oxygenated blood comes back from the lungs through the pulmonary veins into the left side of the heart. And then the left side of the heart pumps that oxygenated blood down to the cells of the body. Now, we also talked about this before. Again, we are, continuing to build on things that we've learned about previously. Now, you remember my lovely drawing about how oxygen, or how arterial blood knows where it's supposed to go. So you got your heart here, and you got your little left ventricle. Okay? Your left ventricle contains oxygenated blood. So the cells that are most metabolically active are going to require the most oxygen. That only makes sense. So what you need to remember is you need to remember the byproducts of metabolism, which are, of course, carbon dioxide, heat, hydrogen ions, right? Now, in weeks 1 and 2, I drilled into your skull, hopefully, that proteins are temperature and pH sensitive. So we talked about the fact that if you change the pH or you change the temperature, that can affect the shape of the protein. Well, let's come back here. Hemoglobin is a protein, and its job is to carry oxygen down to the cells of the body. So it's temperature and pH sensitive. So the arterial blood has that hemoglobin, and each iron is able to bind an oxygen molecule. So as that blood is being pumped by the left ventricle down to the cells of the body, it is going to go to the most metabolically active parts of the body. So these things, these byproducts of metabolism that we spent a bunch of time on, are not only byproducts of metabolism, but they are also massive arterial vasodilators. So they will dilate the arteries that are supplying those parts of the body. So here's my little example. You have your legs and you're running, trying to get to school on time. And then you have your guts. So as you're running, your cells of your legs, your muscle cells, are using ATP. So that is going to produce ADP. We learned that ADP, as it builds up in the cells, stimulates the enzymes of metabolism within the muscle cells of your legs. And that's going to cause metabolism to increase in your leg muscles. So that's going to produce more CO2, more heat, and more hydrogen ions. So what are those going to do to the arteries that supply your legs? It's going to cause them to dilate. And as a result, and we learned that arterial blood always takes the path of least resistance. So when the left ventricle contracts, the vast majority of that oxygenated blood, hold up, here we go, is going to go to the legs. And it makes sense. That's the most metabolically active part, so that's where you want to send the most oxygen. Are your guts metabolically active? No, not really. So are they going to be making a lot of CO2 and heat and No. So those vessels are going to remain constricted, where these vessels are dilating. So when the left ventricle contracts, it's going to send the vast majority of that oxygenated blood to the legs. Now, what are the byproducts of metabolism? They're hydrogen ions, CO2, and heat. So this is really important. As those red blood cells get closer and closer to the most metabolically active parts of your body, right? Because hemoglobin is a protein and it carries oxygen, right? Right? As that red blood cell gets closer and closer to the most metabolically active parts of the body, the hydrogen ions are going to drop the pH, and the heat is going to increase. And remember, hemoglobin is a protein. So as that red blood cell gets closer to the most metabolically active parts of your body, the pH is going to drop and the heat is going to increase. And that is going to change the shape of hemoglobin such that the oxygen can no longer bind to the iron on hemoglobin. So the oxygen will fall off and it will go from high concentration in the blood to low concentration in the cell. So, and watch, the more metabolically active a part of the body is, particular cells of the body are, the lower the pH will become in those cells and the more heat they will produce. And that will change the shape of hemoglobin even more and dump off more oxygen. Also, it will dilate the arteries even more, so it will send more oxygenated blood to those cells. So it is in fact metabolism that dictates your physiology. That's why we had to spend some time learning about metabolism. And I get it. It was a pain in the gluteal fold. I get it. But if you didn't understand at least a little bit of metabolism, then you would never understand this. That was my goal for you. Now, this oxygen has fallen off the iron and it has gone to the cell. So you have desaturated the hemoglobin. So if you want life to continue, which I think you do, you have to somehow resaturate it. So this blood, now that has lost the oxygen, this desaturated blood, is now venous blood. So this venous blood, as you can see, is low in oxygen because it went to the cell, and it's now high in CO2 because CO2 is a byproduct of metabolism. And where do all the veins of the body dump their venous blood? Well, it's going to dump it into the right side of the heart. Now, this is the important piece. The blood that gets into the right side of the heart, that blood, it is going to mix with the blood from the entire body. Now, do you still have to send some blood to the relatively non-metabolically active parts? Sure. So that blood, compared to the blood in the metabolically active parts, is going to be cooler compared to the hot blood that's coming from the metabolically active parts of the body. So all of that blood is going to get dumped into the right ventricle. So the overall temperature of the blood inside the right heart is going to be cooler than it was at the metabolically active parts. And it's also, that blood is now high in CO2. And it's going to go to the right side of the heart. So what do you do on the right side of the heart? You pump that blood, that cooler blood, because it mixed with the blood from the relatively non-metabolically active parts. So it's like taking a hot cup of coffee and then putting a little cool water or even an ice cube in it. So when you mix it, it's going to get cooler. So the temperature of the blood, when it gets to the right side of the heart, is pretty much back to normal. And then you're going to pump that blood, cooler blood, back to the lungs. And when you pump that cool blood back to the lungs, you're going to get rid of CO2. So in the lungs, this is important. In the lungs, the temperature of the blood is lower and the pH is higher because CO2 is an acid. And hemoglobin will then change back its shape to allow oxygen again to bind to the iron on hemoglobin. So that's the story of how oxygen knows to bind to the iron in hemoglobin in the lungs, and then when it gets down to the cell, to let go. Hope that helped.